How the Piano Came to Be by Ellie Howell Glover, written in 1913. From the dried sinews stretched across the shell of a dead tortoise to the concert grand piano of the present day is a far flight. Yet to this primitive source, it is said, may be traced the evolution of the stringed instrument which reached its culmination in the piano. The latter has been aptly called the household orchestra, and in tracing its origin one must go far back into the annals of the past. If we accept the Bible as history, the stringed instrument is of very ancient date. It is recorded that the ambassadors who came to the court of Saul played upon their nebles, and that David, the sweet singer of Israel, wooed the king from his sadness by singing to his harp. We must go back to the civilization of ancient Egypt, more than 500 years before that morning, nearly 2,000 years ago, when, it is written, the angelic choir chanted above the historic manger the glorious message, peace on earth, goodwill to men, and the morning stars sang together. In the olden times, the Greeks laid claim to everything which bespoke culture and progress. The pages of ancient history record no other one thing so persistently as the glory that was Greece, and so they tell the time of when music, heavenly made, was young, and yet in ancient Greece she sung. It is now generally conceded, however, that it was not in Greece but in ancient Egypt that art, music, and the sciences in general were born. That the Egyptians had stringed instruments is unquestionable. Away back in the year 525 BC, Cambyses subdued the land. He overthrew the temples in the ruins of which have been found the records of musical instruments dating from the very earliest times. But the priests who guarded the temples were slain, and every vestige of what might have helped to determine the origin of the stringed instrument, out of which, later, the piano was evolved, as well as the names of those who wrought and endeavored to construct instruments which would give forth music, was forever lost. For lack of written authority, then, one must turn back to tradition for light upon the origin of the piano. Tradition says that Ham, or one of his sons, led the first colony into Egypt. In fact, there is a legend that Noah himself once dwelt there with the great deity of the Egyptians, Osiris. To Hermes, or Mercury, the secretary of Osiris, is ascribed the invention of the first stringed instrument. The story is that Hermes was walking one day along the banks of the Nile. It was just after one of the great inundations. The Nile had overflowed its banks, and the land had been submerged. But now the water had subsided, and as Hermes walked along the shore, his foot struck accidentally against the shell of a dead tortoise. Across the inside of the shell, the dried sinews were tightly stretched. Hermes picked it up and touched the sinews with his fingers. He was amazed to hear the sweet tones which the picking of the strings produced. He set to work to make a musical instrument, using the shell of a tortoise for the body and placing strings across it. In substantiation of this legend, we find in examining the lyre of the ancient Greeks that almost every one was ornamented with a tortoise. We find also in the records of the Hindus, the Chinese, the Persians, and the Hebrews that these people had stringed musical instruments at a very early date, and that the most common among them was the lyre in its various modifications. The famous sepulchre of Ramses III is elaborately ornamented with harps. Specimens of this instrument have been found also in excavations made in comparatively recent years. In 1823, Sir J. G. Wilkinson discovered in an old Egyptian tomb a harp which, despite the fact that 3,000 years had gone by since it had been put to sleep beside its royal master, was in an excellent state of preservation. The strings were of catgut and were in marvelously good condition. The custom which the Egyptians had of portraying their daily life upon their city walls, their temples, and tombs has been of incalculable value to the antiquarians in search of authentic information. From the pictures which ornament these temples and tombs, we have learned that the harp and the lyre were the favorite instruments of the Egyptians, and these carvings alone furnish indisputable proof of their use. But all the research which man, thus far, has been able to make has not revealed just who it was that first discovered music in a lifeless instrument. This fact will always be deeply veiled in mystery. All attempts to unravel the threads have failed. None knows yet just who they were first. Struck the corded shell and, wondering, on their faces fell to worship the celestial sounds. Less than a god they thought there scarce could dwell within the hollow of that shell that spoke so sweetly and so well. Just how many strings Hermes had on his tortoise-shell instrument is a much disputed question. Some say there were but 3, and that they represented the 3 seasons, spring, summer, and winter, into which it was the custom of the Greeks to divide their year. Some authorities claim that the strings numbered 4. Others say there were 7. No one knows. The Greek harp was played by picking the strings with the fingers or with a plectrum. The latter was a small piece of bone or metal held in the fingers with which the strings were snapped. Sometimes a short piece of wood was used to strike the strings. A step forward in the evolution of the stringed instrument was made during the Middle Ages when the psaltery became popular. It consisted of a box with strings across it and records for us the first attempt at a sounding board. This was followed by the dulcimer, which closely resembled it but was somewhat larger. A plectrum was used to play them both. A very good idea of the psaltery and dulcimer may be obtained from the xylophone. This instrument has bars of wood or metal which are struck with a wooden mallet. The keyboard was invented in the 11th century. It was applied first to an instrument called a clavier and later to the organ. The first stringed instrument to which this new device was applied was the clavicatherium, or keyed cithara. It had a box with a cover and strings of catgut, arranged in the form of a half triangle. It was made to sound by means of a quill plectrum attached in a rude way to the end of the keys. This was the progress the piano of today had made in the 13th century. Next in order of development comes the monochord, clarichord, or clavichord, the latter being the name by which it is generally known. As it was the instrument most used during the 6 centuries which followed, it is worthy of close study. In shape, it much resembled a square piano without frame or legs. The strings were of brass, struck by a wedge made of the same metal, which was called a tangent. It was capable of soft tones only, but they were very sweet and melancholy. The elder Bach loved this instrument. He did not take kindly to the piano, which was about to supplant his beloved clavichord. One regrets that he could not have lived to have seen it perfected. In playing the music written by Bach, we must remember that he wrote entirely for the clavichord. The instrument he used was, without doubt, the product of Italy, as during this time the Italians led all Europe in the arts. At a later period, the clavichord was copied by the Germans and Belgians. It was used by them for centuries on account of its simple construction and low price. Mozart always carried one with him as part of his baggage when traveling. The virginal, spinet, and harpsichord followed the clavichord in rapid succession, considering that the last named instrument had been in favor for such a long time, with seemingly no attempt at improvement. All of these 3 instruments had strings of brass, with quill plectra attached to pieces of wood. These were called jacks, a name still used today in making up the action of the piano. The virginal and spinet were almost identical with each other, but the harpsichord was larger and occasionally was built with 2 keyboards. There are several explanations as to why the virginal was so called. One is that it got its name from its association with hymns to the Virgin. Another is that it was thus called in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. We may accept whichever theory best suits us, but history records that both Elizabeth and Mary of Scotland were proficient in its use, and that it was the favorite instrument of Henry VIII. Items for repairs and for instruction in playing the virginal appear frequently in the Royal Expense Book, showing conclusively that His Majesty was not unmindful of such accomplishments. 4 octaves was the range of these old instruments, from the second added line below in the bass to the second added line above in the treble. There was but 1 string to each note, and one can well understand why a writer of that period describes the tone as a scratch with a sound at the end of it. Queen Elizabeth's virginal is still preserved at Worcestershire. It is a most elaborate creation, having a cedar case ornately covered with crimson velvet and lined with yellow silk. Its weight is only 24 pounds. Gold plate covers the front. 30 of its 50 keys are of ebony with tips of gold. The semitone keys are inlaid with silver, ivory, and various woods, each key being composed of 250 pieces. The royal arms are emblazoned upon the case. The Queen's virginal instruction book is also carefully kept, one of the many silent records of the accomplishments of this gifted and brilliant woman. The instrument which belonged, once upon a time, to Mary, Queen of Scots, was not quite so gorgeous. Its case was of oak inlaid with cedar, but it was ornamented with gold and had rare paintings on the case. It was customary to employ the best artists to decorate these instruments, as this greatly enhanced their value. There is a story that Salvatore Rosa, on a wager, made his almost valueless harpsichord worth 1,000 scudi by painting a landscape with figures upon the lid. In July of the year 1701, the London Post had an article relating to virginals which reads, "This week a most curious pair of virginals, reckoned to be the finest in England, were shipped off for the Grand Seigneur's seraglio." Old Pepys, in his diary, gives a description of the great fire in London which occurred in 1666, in which he says, "The river was full of lighters and boats, taking in goods swimming in the water, and only I observed that hardly one lighter or boat, but that there was a pair of virginals on it." The word pair, as it is used then, had no more meaning than we now say a pair of scissors. This extract shows that the instrument must have been almost as commonly used as the piano of our day. In Shakespeare's time, it was customary to have a virginal in a barber shop for the entertainment of customers, probably to beguile the weary moments while they waited for the barber to say next. In shape, the spinet resembled the harp placed horizontally in the framework. A very good example may be seen at the South Kensington Museum in London. It was made by Rossi, a celebrated manufacturer. The Metropolitan Museum in New York has rare specimens of the harp, which were given by the late Mr. Drexel of Philadelphia, who purchased them in Europe. There are two theories as to the origin of the name spinet. One is that it was taken from Spinetti, a Venetian who invented the oblong form of the case. The other is that the strings were made to vibrate by the points of a quill, and that the word spinet came from thorn or point. In tone, the spinet was usually a fifth higher than that of the harpsichord, which came into favor during the 18th century. The latter was almost exactly like our grand piano, only very much smaller. To Italy has been accorded the honor of its origin, also, away back in the 15th century. It was not commonly used, however, until about 1702. A harpsichord on exhibition at the South Kensington Museum in London bears the date of 1521. A step towards the present-day construction of the piano is shown by the fact that there were always 2 wire strings to each note, and sometimes 3 or 4, and that it had a keyboard covering 5 octaves. It was like an organ in that it had register stops and sometimes a double keyboard. Hans Ruckers of Antwerp was the most celebrated maker of the harpsichord in those days. One of his best specimens belongs to the Drexel Collection in New York. Handel delighted in his Rücker's harpsichord and gave it preference over all others, which is adequate proof of its superiority. It was his pleasure to play upon it long after his failing eyesight forbade the use of notes. He had to improvise entirely, but was so expert that the orchestra with whom he played was often diverted by his wonderful accompaniments. This partiality was resented by the soloists, and one of them told Handel that if he ever played him such a trick while he was singing, he would jump down on his harpsichord and smash it. This amused Handel immensely, and he exclaimed, "You will jump, will you? Very well, sir. Be so kind and tell me when you will jump, and I will advertise it on the bills." We are told that the very key of Handel's instrument was hollow like the bowl of a spoon, so incessant was his practice. One very lovely harpsichord still in existence has its history veiled in mystery, but the supposition is that it once belonged to Marie Antoinette. Clementi had one of the last harpsichords made. The date upon the case was 1802. Beethoven's famous Moonlight Sonata was written for either harpsichord or piano. It was published in 1802. Hummel played on the harpsichord as late as 1805, but it had to give way, though most reluctantly, to the new invention called the pianoforte. Just how slow the public was in accepting the innovation and improvement upon the instruments mentioned, the following quotation from a folio gotten out by Thomas Mace, who was one of the clerks of Trinity College at the University of Cambridge, testifies. He was pleased to call his booklet Music's Monument, and it was printed in 1676 in London. He scorned the new invention, but warmly upheld the lute and viol. He explained that the lute was once considered difficult to play because it had too few strings, only 10 to 14, while at the time of his writing, it had 16 to 26. He makes the statement that he never spent more than $1.25 for strings. The care of a lute he describes quaintly. And that you may know how to shelter your lute in the worst of ill weathers, which is moist, you shall do well, ever when you lay it by in the daytime, to put it into a bed that is constantly used, between the rug and blanket, but never between the sheets, because they may be moist. This is the most absolute and best place to keep it in always, by which doing you will find many great conveniences. Therefore, a bed will secure you from all these inconveniences, and keep your glue as hard as glass, and all safe and secure. Only to be accepted, that no person be so inconsiderate as to tumble down upon the bed whilst the lute is there, for I have known several good lutes spoiled with such a trick. Again, we are indebted to Italy for the invention and name of the pianoforte. It is a strange fact that, entirely unknown to one another, 3 men were working on the same principle, namely the hammer action, at the same time. Marius in France, Schroeder in Germany, and Cristofori in Italy worked secretly and simultaneously, and for a long time it was undecided to whom the honor really belonged. A careful examination of all records, however, establishes beyond a doubt the priority of Cristofori's claim. The hammer action was what all previous instruments lacked, and it seemed strange that it took nearly 2,000 years for this principle to be discovered and applied. Many times the inventors appeared to be almost upon it. They worked all around it, but the idea seemed elusive and they never grasped it. At this point, it might be well to enumerate in order the instruments which preceded the piano, if only to fasten them clearly in memory. The lyre and harp of the ancients, the dulcimer, played by means of the plectra, and to which, as the hand could use but one plectrum, there was a keyboard added to use all the fingers, thus moving the plectra faster. The clavichord, with tangents of brass to strike the strings. The virginal and the spinet, in reality the same. The harpsichord, with its crow quills to half rub, half strike the strings, still far away from the hammer action of the present-day piano. It seems almost unaccountable that the manufacturers who so greatly improved the mechanism of the harpsichord at this stage failed to discover the hammer action. But at last, after the quest of centuries, the quill, thorn, and ivory were discarded, and a small hammer struck the string, giving a clear, precise, but delicate tone hitherto unheard. The scratch with a sound at the end was gone forever. The harpsichord had been changed into an instrument of percussion, and it only remained for man to perfect that primitive creation into the superb piano of today. Although Italy gave the invention to the world, it remained for Northern Europe and England to take up the idea and improve it. Cristofori solved three important problems. First, the construction of thicker strings to withstand the hammer action. Second, a way to compensate for the weakness caused by the opening in the tuning pin block. Third, the mechanical control of the rebound of the hammer from the strings, so that the hammer should not block against the latter and prevent vibration. The first Cristofori instrument was brought out in 1709. Marius did not come forth with his claim until 1716, and Schroeder not until the next year. The name pianoforte is traced clearly to the year 1598 and is said to have been originated by an Italian named Pagliarino. In some of his manuscripts, he mentions an instrument called piano e forte. The English put in a claim for a monk living in Rome who had made an instrument resembling Cristofori's in 1711 and had brought it to England, where it created a profound sensation. This may have been true, but England did little to develop even the harpsichord until long after continental makers had achieved marked success in the business. In 1760, German workmen to the number of 12 went to London. They were known as the 12 Apostles, and it is their descendants who became identified with the successful development of the piano down to the present time. Very few of the first Cristofori pianos have been preserved. One, in excellent repair, is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Two are in Florence, dated 1720 and 1726. They show beyond a doubt that he had anticipated the plan of escapement and hammer checking. Like many other pioneer inventors, this man died in comparative poverty. Schroeder, the German claimant, became a famous maker of instruments. He succeeded in improving the piano to a large extent, but his life was made miserable fighting the claims of other manufacturers who sprang up and immediately went into business. Marius met the same fate, being driven to distraction by competitors, some of whom turned out instruments far superior to his. England did not accomplish much before the middle of the 18th century. Up to 1760, all pianos were made in what is known as the grand form. Then a German in the employ of the Schuttis, famous makers of harpsichord, invented the familiar square style. At the beginning of the 19th century, the most noted European makers were the Steins, Stoddart, Broadwood, Pleyel, Erard, and Silbermann. Pleyel was distinguished not only for his fine instruments, but for the fact that he was the 24th child born to his mother after she married Martin Pleyel. Pleyel was chapel master of Strasbourg Cathedral. He was the author of some fine hymns and other compositions which we know and love today. He lived in Paris, manufactured splendid pianos, and was, before his death, proprietor of one of the largest establishments in Europe. To show against what prejudice the piano had to struggle as compared to the harpsichord and even the clavichord, we quote from a musical critic in Leipzig who said, "The clavichord stands highest of all instruments, and although on account of its nature it is excluded from the concert hall, it is the companion of the recluse. The latter says to himself, 'Here I can produce the feelings of my heart, can shade fully, drive away care, and melt away a tone through all its swellings.'" This critic says further, "The piano is so deficient in its shadings and minor attractions, it is adapted only for concerts and chamber music." This dissertation closes as follows. In order to judge a virtuoso, one must listen to him while at the clavichord, not while at the piano or harpsichord. To illustrate the novelty of the piano in the year 1767, we find on an old English playbill of the Covent Garden Theatre a certain Miss Brickler, advertised to sing a favorite song from Judith, accompanied by Mr. Dibbin on a new instrument called the pianoforte. This was at the intermission after the first act of the Beggar's Opera. After Mozart became acquainted with the piano, he gave his preference to those made by Stein of Augsburg. Afterwards, however, he transferred his affection to those made by Anton Walter of Vienna. His grand, which was but 5 octaves, with white sharps and black neutrals, is now in the Mozarteum at Salzburg. Silbermann, the German maker, was finally successful in interesting King Frederick of Prussia in his new instrument, to the extent of persuading him to purchase outright all he had finished. There were some 15 of these, which were placed in the rooms at the palace. This demonstrates the king's love for music. He was a flute player of considerable ability. One of the court musicians was Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, son of the great master, and King Frederick had expressed a desire to hear the elder Bach play upon the new invention. For some time, old Sebastian was obstinate and tartly declined all invitations. His son at last cajoled him into accepting the king's wishes. He arrived most unexpectedly and excited the king to such an extent that he rushed out, exclaiming, "Gentlemen, old Bach has come." During the performance, he stood behind the musician's chair, muttering in an undertone, "Only one Bach, only one Bach." The king requested the improvisation of a fugue in 6 parts, which the master did to the astonishment of all present. But for the new instrument, Bach had little use. He complimented Silbermann on his production, but he found fault with the unequal tones. He said the high notes were too weak and that it was too hard to play. Of course, this greatly displeased the maker. For a long time he was very angry, but his better judgment came to the rescue, and at a later date he succeeded in producing an instrument to which the master gave his approval. Bach, however, was never convinced that any instrument was equal to his beloved clavichord. It will be of interest to women to know that Maria Anna Stein, daughter of Johann Andreas Stein, the piano maker, was a most successful businesswoman, carrying on the manufacturing of instruments. This she continued after her marriage to Herr Streicher. She was a person of rare refinement and a warm friend of Beethoven, whom she greatly admired. She was privileged to make his last years more comfortable than any he had previously experienced. Good servants were provided to look after his bodily needs, and she always had one of her best pianos at his disposal. In a letter to Nanette, as she was called, he wrote, "Perhaps you do not know that though I have not always had one of your pianos, since 1809, I have invariably preferred them." As late as 1882, there was a grand piano at Windsor Castle, which bore the name of Nanette Stein, maker. It belonged to Queen Victoria. Clementi may be considered the first legitimate writer for the piano. All the great masters, including Scarlatti, Handel, Bach, and Haydn, in his first compositions, were written for the clavichord. So when listening to the classics they have left for us, we must remember the limitations of the instruments upon which they played and for which they wrote. Good night.